As we jump into the movies of May of 1970, we begin with Equinox, a curious sci-fi thriller that was conceived by Dennis Muren while he was studying business at Pasadena City College and originally made into a low-budget short film called The Equinox, A Journey into the Supernatural. Later, the fledgling Tonlin Productions liked the film and hired Jack Woods, who was a frequent collaborator with John Cassavetes, to add additional footage to turn it into a feature. It got an initial release in Dallas, Texas, and made its way around the midnight movie circuit, but it disappeared for years until after Muren won the Oscar for his visual effects work on Star Wars. Okay, so that's the history. How's the movie? To be honest, it's more a curiosity than anything else. The story of a group of college kids discovering a satanic book that unleashes hell on Earth is a primer for Sam Raimi's Evil Dead, and that film, to be honest with you, is a lot better. And it's notable for having a rare film role for actor Frank Bonner Jr., who is best known as Herb Tarlick on WKRP in Cincinnati. Perhaps because of Muren's attachment, it got a DVD release as part of the Criterion in 2006, but personally, I don't really think it's really worth the effort. There were a lot of films about the counterculture in 1970, and I can safely say that 99% of them were generally terrible. One notable exception was Getting Straight. Elliot Gould plays Harry Bailey, a Vietnam vet and former activist who wanders in and out of anti-war protests while resisting the impulse to once again get involved. He wants to move on with his life, finish graduate school, and become a teacher. This is a very smart and stylish movie directed by Richard Rush, who directed films that seemed to be edging toward populist entertainment but were really smarter than they had any reason to be. Films like A Man Called Dagger, The Stuntman, and Freebie and the Bean. Getting Straight is a good movie and a great time capsule showing us a time when people actually considered political involvement based on logic and morality rather than just knee-jerk emotions. Okay, I'm gonna tread lightly here. Let It Be, like Woodstock and King, A Filmed Record, is another great time capsule, but with an interesting history. What started out as Paul McCartney's attempts to capture footage of the Beatles putting together an album that was more raw and unplugged than what they had previously been doing, ultimately ended up being an unhappy chronicle of their last year together. You can see and feel the tensions between John and Paul over where their heads are and what they wanted to create, and it's painful to watch these two old friends at odds with each other. But the movie ends with that rooftop concert, which captures the pure magic of the Beatles one last time. The film has had an uneasy time with distribution. I've seen it twice in my life, first on RCA video disc and later on VHS. It's very hard to find. Rumor has it that subsequent attempts at a re-release were held up by McCartney and Ringo Starr because they said they didn't want to tarnish the brand, which is understandable. What is not understandable is that in the same year, there were two quasi-sensitive portraits of incest. First was Brotherly Love, which somehow made it work because of Peter O'Toole's performance, but the other, My Lover, My Son, well, doesn't. Directed by John Newland and based on the book Reputation for a Song by Edward Grierson, it tells the story of Francesca, who lavishes uncomfortable attention on her son James, and then the movie beats itself to death to make that incestuous attraction make sense. It's filtered through a murder plot that ends up in a court trial that makes the film's third act kind of dull and really strange. The movie doesn't work, though I give it points for trying. It feels more like one of those books that might have been on your mother's nightstand, which complements our next movie, based on a book that might have been on your dad's nightstand. This is The Delta Factor, based on a 1967 novel by Mickey Spillane about a CIA agent who recruits a convict. Sound familiar? To help her go to the Caribbean islands to help rescue a kidnapped scientist who's being held as a political prisoner. But it's not the best adaptation of Spillane. His works are best when they deal with moral ambiguity of the lead characters. This one feels like a James Bond ripoff. It's so ridiculous it's almost parody. I'm surprised it hasn't turned up on riff tracks. And if The Delta Factor was a dud that I expected more from, then The Landlord is a movie from which I expected nothing. And that has a lot to do with this trailer, which sells the film as a comedy of racial buffoonery, and so does the poster. But this is a smartly written little movie about human beings, directed in his debut by Hal Ashby and gorgeously photographed by the legendary Gordon Willis. Based on a novel by Kristen Hunter, the movie stars Beau Bridges in maybe his best performance as Elgar, a 29-year-old rich kid who still lives with his parents and who decides on a whim to buy a tenement in a poor black neighborhood with the intention of throwing out the residents and turning the place into a bachelor pad. But it doesn't work out that way, as his associations with the actual tenants, a fortune teller played brilliantly by Pearl Bailey, and a sensitive hairdresser played by Diana Sands, throw him into a humanistic journey that causes him to reevaluate his priorities. If all of this sounds dated and familiar, that's because it is, and if the plot sounds mildly like the Joe Pesci misfire the Super, you wouldn't be wrong either. But this film is way better. The Landlord is written with such a laid-back style and an earthy sensibility that you never feel like you're being spoon-fed an issue. This is a very smartly written little drama with interesting characters whose motivations come from who they are, not from what the plot requires of them. If there's a flaw, it's probably in the characters of Elgar's rich white parents, whose scenes are uncomfortable and just seem to serve to give the film an easy villain. Outside of that, it's a good little lost gem. Our next movie should have been a gem. I say that because I'm such a fan of Sammy Davis Jr. One More Time is a sequel to 1968's Salt and Pepper, which was a good movie in which United Artists tried to build a Hope and Crosby-type comedy team out of former Rat Packers Sammy and Peter Lawford. They were funnier in the early movie, and that may have had something to do with the fact that it was directed by Richard Donner. This sequel was directed by Jerry Lewis, and it shows. It has more of Jerry's manic comic style, which admittedly is less annoying with Sammy doing it than Jerry. Sammy and Peter play Charles Salt and Christopher Pepper, who lose their nightclub, and then turn to Pepper's twin brother for help, which he refuses, and then is found dead, so Pepper assumes his identity, and, well, wackiness ensues. That's the central plot. The movie is a lot of weird gags and mugging and manic energy, and occasionally Sammy gets to stop the movie cold for a musical number. I think Sammy gives 152% here, but ultimately all the best bits are in the trailer, and really, this is one of those comedies that just kind of leaves you with a headache. Too Late the Hero is director Robert Aldrich's follow-up to The Dirty Dozen, in which he more or less does the same thing, only the results aren't quite as exciting. Whereas the other film took place in the European theater, this one takes place in the Pacific, and follows Michael Caine, Cliff Robertson, Henry Fonda, Ian Bannon, Denholm Elliott, and Harry Andrews in a mission to commandeer a Japanese radio transmitter in order to send the wrong message to the enemy. You might guess nothing goes right either for the plan or the movie. Aldrich tries for the energy of The Dirty Dozen, but the action scenes go on too long, and it takes forever for the movie to get going, and even longer for it to reach its conclusion. Reviews at the time were mixed. It was just kind of given an eh. Gene Siskel hated it. But based on this cast, it did much better in England than it did here in the States. I'll say it's a lot more sure-footed than Norwood. You know, I'm seeing a pattern here with One More Time and Too Late the Hero, and now Norwood as desperate attempts to cash in on past success. That's an 80s gimmick. Norwood was an attempt to test the viability of country singer Glenn Campbell as a leading man after the success of True Grit a year earlier. It even has Kim Darby, who co-starred in that same film, and it's based on another book by Charles Portis. This one doesn't really have a plot. It's an episodic series of events following Norwood Pratt as he returns home from Vietnam and runs into a long series of colorful characters. It's like the Odyssey of Gomer Pyle without the laugh track. It's strange. It tries to fuse the aw shucks mentality returning home from World War II onto the Vietnam era. The result is a movie that feels wildly out of place. Critics generally dismissed it. Gene Siskel hated it. Today it's generally slipped out of common knowledge. Which unfortunately was the fate of Connecting Rooms, which I liked quite a bit. This is a tender romantic drama based on a Marion Hart play called The Cellist, and featuring a wonderful latter-day performance by Bette Davis as an accomplished cellist who lives in a crummy boarding house and can only express her music on the streets for money. This puts her in conflict with two men, one a scoundrel who is after that money, the other a gentleman who was run out of his profession on a false charge of pedophilia. That's simplistic, but it's really only on the surface. This is a very emotional experience about very specific people and how they connect with one another. And again, featuring a magnificent performance by Davis as a woman who believes that perhaps she's gotten older and love has passed her by. Impressive still is the fact that the movie never really feels stagey, despite its origins. It was directed and co-written by Franklin Gollings, who creates a space within the boarding house so that we get a sense of each character and how they connect with one another. It's really, really good and worth seeking out. Before Rocky and Star Wars, sequels were rare. You had follow-ups, but not generally sequels. One exception for 1970 was Beneath the Planet of the Apes, the first of 4 sequels based on the Planet of the Apes, and actually one of the better ones, although not the best in my opinion. This was the first time I'd seen this movie, and yeah, I mean, it covers some of the same ground as the first movie, but about midway through it ventures off on its own. James Franciscus is in the lead this time as Brent, an astronaut who crash landed on the same planet looking for Charlton Heston's crew. He hooks up with a mute woman named Nova, and while on the run from the guerrilla army, discovers an underground complex occupied by a race of mutants who worship a nuclear bomb. Critics were pretty down on this picture. Gene Siskel hated it, with most citing it as an inferior letdown that ups the action but lessens the original social commentary. That may be true, but I give it points for at least trying something different and offering a dark ending that makes you wonder what the next film could possibly be about. We'll see in 1971. Another movie that I saw for the first time for this project was Cotton Comes to Harlem, which I've only ever heard about. Mostly what I've heard is that if you think that Shaft and Sweet Sweetback are the forefathers of the decade's blaxploitation genre, then you really need to do your homework, because Cotton Comes to Harlem came first, and to my surprise, I think it's better than either one of those. Directed by Ossie Davis, who adapted Charles Hymes' novel with playwright Arnold Pearl, it chronicles two Harlem cops, Coffin Ed and Gravedigger Jones, played respectively by Godfrey Cambridge and Raymond St. Jacques, who are out to bring down a con artist, the Reverend Deke O'Malley, who has taken $87,000 of the community's money for his program that he alleges will help the citizens of Harlem get back to Africa. But then there's a heist and the money goes missing, and in the ensuing chase, the bad guys drop a bale of Mississippi cotton on a street corner. So it's up to the duo to round up the Reverend and his cohorts and find out where the missing money has gone and what that bale of cotton was really all about. It's really as simple as that. The search for the money sends the duo on a journey through Harlem into a gaggle of weird and interesting characters. None better, in my opinion, than a bum played by Red Fox, who is surprisingly restrained here in what might be his best performance. He won the year's NAACP Image Award for Best Supporting Actor, and it was this performance that got him noticed by television producer Aaron Rubin when he was casting the lead for Sanford & Son. Cotton Comes to Harlem, alas, is not perfect. It has structural problems, and there are way too many characters to keep up with, and some of the comedy bits, like a cop who gets caught naked in public, don't work at all. But the movie's so entertaining that you forgive those flaws. Unfortunately, I had a harder time forgiving the flaws in The Out-of-Towners, the first Neil Simon script that he wrote exclusively for the screen. This is a broad, balls-out comedy starring Jack Lemmon and Sandy Dennis as George and Gwendolyn Kendall, an entitled couple who are on a trip to New York where George is going to meet with his new bosses. But anything and everything that can go wrong goes wrong. Flight is late, they lose their luggage, they can't get a hotel room, they get robbed, they end up spending the night in Central Park, they get attacked by a dog, they lose their wallets, their money, their shoes, their watches. It's just a series of escalating frustration, and unfortunately none of it is funny, particularly because Lemmon plays a complete jerk who spends most of the movie screaming and threatening lawsuits. That's disappointing because you should know Lemmon is my favorite actor, and when he plays a real character, as he did with CeCe Baxter in The Apartment, or Jerry in Some Like It Hot, or Shel Levine in Glengarry Glen Ross, he's really one of the century's great actors, but here he just gets on your nerves with his constant threats and shouting and whining. Critics generally agreed. Gene Siskel hated it. The idea of a nightmare road comedy can work, as it would later in National Lampoon's Vacation and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, but here I just got annoyed because every bad situation could be solved instantly if Lemmon would just calm down. But any objection that I had to The Out-of-Towners pales to the disdain that I have for The Watermelon Man, the single worst movie of the year and maybe the decade. The year 1970 was jam-packed with these perspectives on black culture and black identity, mostly created and written from a white perspective, but they always came through with an understanding that at best seemed based on logic. This one stumbles over would-be laughs bred from stereotypes of old minstrel shows. For my money, this was the worst. How bad? It was so bad that I actually considered skipping it. Directed by Melvin Van Peebles and written by Herman Rauscher, the man responsible for Summer of 42, The Watermelon Man stars Godfrey Cambridge in an embarrassing performance as Jeff Gerber, a white racist insurance agent who makes life a living nightmare for anyone around him who isn't white. And then he wakes up one day to find himself a black man. Wackiness ensues. There's a lot of potential here for some smart writing and carefully laid out performance by Cambridge, but both the writing and his performance have all the subtlety of a busted chainsaw. Thank God we've moved past movies like this. And if The Watermelon Man was the most wretched bad movie of 1970, then I can say that the Phynx was bad in a way that can only be described as fascinating. It's a train wreck.
I fear to watch, yet I cannot turn away.
The Phynx is a wacky parody of both rock and roll and James Bond, with a comedy style that lies somewhere between Sid and Marty Krofft and Laugh-In. The United States government initiates a plan to rescue kidnapped world leaders who are being held in Albania by training a bunch of outsiders to be a rock and roll band who will take over the world with their acid rock music, and then be invited to play Albania, where they'll break into the compound where the leaders are being held and rescue them. The leaders, by the way, make up the movie's insane gaggle of cameos, which include Clint Walker, Richard Pryor, Harold Sakata, Dick Clark, Ed Sullivan, Rona Barrett, Martha Ray, Joan Blondell, Fritz Feld, Maureen O'Sullivan, Pat O'Brien, Marilyn Maxwell, Georgie Jessel, Johnny Weissmuller, Cass Daly, Joe Lewis, Leo Gorcey and Hans Hall, Xavier Cugat, Busby Berkeley, Ruby Keeler, Dorothy Lamour, Rudy Valley, Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy, Patty Andrews and Lewis Hayward, the Lone Ranger and Tonto, and for some reason Colonel Sanders. Most of these people merely walk onto a movie that is all walk-ons. It would have been great if there was a behind-the-scenes documentary so we could find out what this future TCM lineup thought about all of this. I'm sure most of them are happy to be asked to do anything. I remember that Gilbert Gottfried kept bringing it up on his podcast. When he would list off the cast, it became one of those movies that you just had to see, and then afterwards you're kind of sorry you saw it. The Phynx is a curiosity. There's not a moment when you can stop gawking at the bizarre nature of what is happening long enough for the movie to build up a laugh. It grates on your nerves, and yet, I might recommend it. It's just strange enough to warrant a look. Personally, if I had to struggle to find the dubious nature of any film, I'd rather move toward a far more enjoyable mess like Two Mules for Sister Sara, a western comedy romance that is, in fact, both enjoyable and a mess. The result is a movie that I enjoyed despite its messiness. Clint Eastwood is here in a western far lighter than those that he made with Sergio Leone. This one is directed by his Dirty Harry director Don Siegel. He plays a western drifter, a man with a name. His name is Hogan, and he drifts along the southern border of the United States in the wake of the Civil War, and comes across a woman about to be raped by a trio of drunken bandits. Dispatching these thugs in the typical Eastwood manner, he discovers that the woman is actually a nun named Sister Sara, and played by Shirley MacLaine. After a lot of conversation, he discovers that she is wanted by a Mexican general, and that she needs him to guide her to safety. That sets off a rather fun odyssey, as Hogan battles not only the elements, the Indians, and the thugs who wander the plains, but also his raging affections for a woman behind the habit. This is an odd turn for Eastwood, who lightens up his western persona with far more talky character, and is saddled with a strong female lead, something that would not happen much in his career. Fortunately, he is saddled with Shirley MacLaine in a terrific performance as a character that is actually written well, except for an unwise twist at the end that pulled me right out of the movie. Two Mules for Sister Sara is not perfect. It's a structural mess, and the tone wavers between romantic it happened one night shenanigans to a bloodbath climax that, while technically good, is kind of a mismatch to the journey that we've been following. It's one of those uneven movies where you decide which parts you enjoy. And as spring gives way to summer, we step into the movies of June. When we come back, Sleeping Beauty comes back, Streisand bounces back, Dracula bites back, and H.R. Pufnstuf takes you back.
Been fishing June, a shady.
This little girl, their mother and father too. They all have an urge, and oh, what an urge for something to munch and chew. Now these are just swell, and this rings a bell. The popcorn is crispy and hot. Then others again have a terrible yen for a drink that hits the spot. Go. So if you want candy, the lobby is handy. A counter with sweets and a crew. With your confirmation, we're having a mission. We're ready to serve all of you.
Moving into the movies of June, we begin with Taste the Blood of Dracula, very likely the most toothless Dracula movie ever made, and there have been a lot of them. It was the fifth Hammer movie to feature Dracula and the fourth to star Christopher Lee, but he was so reluctant to reprise the role that the movie was originally written without Dracula in it. Reportedly, it took a lot of painting his palm green before he would say yes, and he would still play the role several more times, one of which, The Scars of Dracula, came out later in the same year. We'll cover that when we get to November. As for Taste the Blood of Dracula, the story actually sounds a lot better on paper than it plays out on screen. 3 English gentlemen are bored one night and get in contact with Count Dracula's old servant, Lord Courtly, who eventually helps them resurrect their boss. But Courtly ends up dead by their hands, and the Count sets it up so that they will be murdered by their own children. Now see, that sounds interesting, but the movie takes forever to get going, and Dracula doesn't show up for a good long while. You can tell Lee's heart was not really in this movie, and it comes off more as a snooze than anything else. Just a note, I recorded the next review on the very day that Marty Krause passed away, and that was not on purpose. My heart goes out. He and his brother created a wondrous body of work that became part of my childhood, and I know I'm not alone. Opening on American movie screens on the exact same day as Taste the Blood of Dracula was this delightful fellow. And if you're anywhere near my half-century in age, you don't have to be told who this is. For the uninitiated, this is H.R. Pufnstuf, star of one of the most popular kid shows of the early 70s, even though it only lasted a scant 17 episodes. Blasting into theaters just after the short run ended, Pufnstuf was a feature-length attempt to recoup some of the losses wrought by the series. The show was extraordinarily popular, but the cost of production led to its premature demise. The movie is an origin story. If you know the show's elongated opening, which draws out the story, then this movie is that story. A boy named Jack finds a magic flute named Freddy and boards a boat where he is whisked away to a magical island where everything comes to life. There's a living clock, trees that talk, a wise old owl, and H.R. Pufnstuf himself, who serves as the island's mayor. And of course there's Witchy Poo, a wicked witch who wants to steal the flute for no other reason than to show it off at the witches' convention that's being held at her castle. Actually, despite the movie's title, the witch really owns this movie. She gets most of the screen time and takes up most of the story, which largely involves repeated attempts to procure the flute before the boss witch, played in a surprisingly low-key performance by Martha Ray, and her closest frenemy, played in a droll performance by Cass Elliot, get to her castle for a party. And yes, Cass Elliot does get to sing, and yes, Mama Cass does get to sing, and there's an elaborate production number. Fun fact, she was Sid Croft's next-door neighbor. That's how she got the part. I saw this movie the other night, and I had to smile. It took me back, and I think the wave of nostalgia carried me through. But I began to wonder if the uninitiated would get it. In other words, will your kids enjoy it? Yeah, I think so. It's bright and colorful and wacky and have no nutritional value whatsoever. That, I think, is what made it a hit. Yeah, the witch can get a little irritating. She's one of the most caffeinated villains you'll ever see. But kudos to the late Billy Hayes for keeping the role constantly at a mirror-crack velocity all through the picture. I don't know how uninitiated adults will take it, but show it to your kids. It's harmless. I think they'll love it. Turning things completely around, we now come to the Invincible Six, one of countless moribund would-be revisionist westerns from this era, an international production, but at heart really just a rip-off of Seven Samurai and Magnificent Seven. And it stars a lot of second-rate familiar faces: Stuart Whitman, Elkie Summer, Kurt Jurgens, James Mitchum, and it's the kind of caper movie that you sense started out with much more ambition but turned out to be just a confusing pile of junk. It's about a Texan who cobbles together a team in Iran with plans to steal the crown jewels. But when that goes belly up, then there's some nonsense about a famous bandit and an amulet and a romance between Whitman and Summer. Meanwhile, she tries to find reasons to keep taking her clothes off. Let's put it this way, The Invincible Six is the kind of movie that inspired Tarantino, and that he would turn into movies with much more style. And if 2-bit westerns aren't your thing in June of 1970, there was always Disney to fall back on. 1970 had the first re-release of Sleeping Beauty, and at a moment when the studio was entering its creative dark period in the wake of Walt's death, it was probably best to be reminded of the glory days. Originally released in 1959, Sleeping Beauty is an epic. This is a big movie, a mass evolution of the art form, and you can see that in the films made in Walt's lifetime. And further proof can be seen in the decline in quality of the films made by the studio in the 2 decades immediately following his death. We'll see one of them later in the year. Sleeping Beauty represents the best of Disney's glory years. It is the best work his creative team had done artistically since Bambi 30 years earlier. It has a watercolor beauty that is in harmony with the subject matter. The stylized animation borrows heavily from medieval art and, along with the lovely addition of the music of Tchaikovsky, the use of watercolor backgrounds offers a storybook feel. Unfortunately, it was also the closing chapter of the greatness that the studio had in Walt's lifetime, at least as far as animation goes. The process employed here proved to be too expensive, and so the animation department adopted that sketchy style that was cost-effective but not as eye-catching. The new process involved Xeroxing the cells rather than painting them by hand. This would save time and money, but since the cells could only be rendered in black, we lost a lot of those nuances that made Bambi and Cinderella and Fantasia so beautiful. The cinematography isn't bad, but it does feel like a step backwards. The story of Sleeping Beauty is simplistic but still compelling. The royal family snubs Malevolent Fairy Maleficent, say that 3 times fast, and fail to invite her to the presentation of their daughter Princess Aurora, and so Maleficent responds by cursing the child to prick her finger on the needle of a spinning wheel on her 16th birthday and drop dead. Actually, I kind of wonder what might have happened if they did invite her to the party. I was also thinking that the curse is insanely cruel. Think about it. Your child is cursed to know exactly the day of their death, and you are essentially powerless to stop it. Actually, this is kind of a trend among early Disney villains. Remember when the villain in Snow White plotted to have the heroine's heart cut out, and then when that failed, tried to have her buried alive? Or you remember the coachman in Pinocchio who wanted to turn bad kids into donkeys and then sell them to coal mines? How about Cruella de Vil who wanted to chop up puppies to make coats? I'll give it to Walt, he didn't sugarcoat these villains. And yeah, we won't talk about that other thing. Anyway, what works best in Sleeping Beauty are the side characters. They're kind of bumbling heroes. It's nice to see middle-aged women get to be part of the action. And I love the villain. This is Disney's best. Maleficent is pure evil. She does evil things, she speaks in a devilish voice, she commands others to her will, and her battle with the prince is a masterwork of action and animation. Just about the only thing that doesn't work is Sleeping Beauty herself. Yeah, she's pretty, but she's also about as interesting as a 5-pound sack of fertilizer. And yeah, this was a trope in the 1950s. A beautiful woman was expected to look pretty and land a rich husband. It is very much a movie of its time. But, you know what? Snow White and Cinderella came earlier. And they were in the same situation, but they came off with cheerful optimism. Princess Aurora has nothing. But the thing is, she's kind of a small part of this movie. She doesn't motivate the story. Like Snow White, things really just happen to her, so she and her drywall personality don't really get in the way. The best thing is that when you come away from it, you're not really focused on that flaw. The story and the animation work so well that you hardly notice. This is a beautiful film, an exciting film, a masterwork of art and storytelling. And in 1970, a year when Disney was entering its dark era, we probably needed it. And I can say so is the Strawberry Statement, but probably not in the best way. This is yet another hippy-dippy film from the year, this one loosely based on a book by James Simon Coonan, and starring Bruce Davison as Simon, a college kid who has no interest in political action, who meets a girl named Linda, played by Kim Darby again, and they have a sweet romance until he decides to get involved and finds himself in the middle of a police riot at Columbia University. I've seen this movie. I know it was a box office flop, and I kind of see why. The movie meanders, the characters aren't really drawn beyond the plot, and in its political leanings, it really makes the protesters look like saints and the police look like demons. It reminds me of some of the strawman Christian movies where you sanctify one side of the equation in order to tell the intended what they want to hear. The movie failed financially and critically. Gene Siskel hated it. Vincent Canby called it a 103-minute commercial, and Gary Arnold of the Washington Post said it hadn't earned its catharsis. Whatever that means. Staying on track with the theater of the weird, this was an era of experimentation, let's not forget that, was a movie that I think a lot of people have heard about, but very few have actually seen. This is Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, and these days probably the only point of interest for your average viewer is that it was the only screenplay written by the beloved film critic Roger Ebert. But there's a lot more to it than that. Russ Meyer took over the project, which was originally supposed to be a sequel to the very serious Valley of the Dolls, before it took a toboggan ride into the lunacy of what happens when a studio, in this case 20th Century Fox, gives up on the project and the producer is more or less allowed to do what he wants. So the sequel became a satire, and without adult supervision, Meyer and Ebert created, well, this. By that, the movie is kind of incoherent if you don't know what it's trying to be, and likely doesn't make more sense if you do. It's a parody of several things: Douglas Sirk pictures, psychedelic hippie movies, and chest-heaving romantic women's pictures. Basically the stuff that Hollywood doesn't make anymore. Therefore, its standing in the modern culture remains a nostalgic curiosity. That's a nice way of saying that when people watch it, they come away with the standard, what were they smoking when they wrote this? I won't assume that drugs were involved, since Ebert's recollection was that he and Meyer wrote the film in 6 weeks and often laughed themselves silly. I think it makes a lot more sense when you know that. I can see that the construction was probably better than the execution. This is one of those kitchen sink movies where everything is thrown in willy-nilly without much consideration of how the pieces fit, as long as the pieces were weird and colorful and unconventional. Out of those efforts, we get Nazis, sexual assault, corporate instability, mutilation, rock and roll, lesbian sex, bondage, a homicidal transsexual, public nudity, abortions, decapitations, and since this is a Russ Meyer movie, boobs. Lots and lots and lots of boobs. There's a reason he was called King Lear. This is a very, very strange film, and I think everybody will come away with a different idea of it. I don't recommend it unless you're very, very adventurous. And in case you're wondering, yes, Gene Siskel hated it. I'll say that it's way more interesting than our next film. This is The Hawaiian, a second film based on James Michener's 937-page book Hawaii, first published in 1959, which tried to be about the entire evolutionary and cultural history of the islands. And when you know that it's based on a book by Michener, you kind of already know what you're getting. He was a lot like Tom Clancy. He tended to write books that made handy doorstops. The first film, Hawaii, made in 1966, was pretty good, earned 7 Oscar nominations, got good reviews, and good box office. But given Michener's unfamiliarity with brevity, it covered barely 1 chapter. That film was based on the book's 3rd chapter, and this one is based on the later chapters covering the arrival of Japanese and Chinese laborers. It makes me wonder why they didn't just turn it into one of those network miniseries that were so hot at the time. This sequel takes place a generation later and tries to cover a lot more ground, but it ends up being too full of characters, too full of subplots, and tries to cram 6 hours worth of story into 137 minutes. It's bland, it's overstuffed, and yeah, it's kind of racist. I mean, there's a Chinese peasant played by Mako who is named Monkey. Yeah. As you might guess, the movie is mostly about white people problems with the non-white characters just along for the ride. Charlton Heston plays, get this, Whip Hawksworth, a ridiculous name that's still more dignified than Monkey. Heston is a seafaring trader who returns to the island only to find that his family fortune has been turned over to his cousin Noel, played by John Philip Law, which sets off a bitter family feud. In the middle are a bunch of subplots involving dignity, honor, marital rights, and off to the side is a somewhat creepy performance by Geraldine Chaplin as a woman who's slowly going mad under the stress. I mean, to hell with the poor people. Again, this is a movie that tried to do too much with white characters and not enough with non-white characters. It might have done well as one of those mini-series on NBC, ABC, or CBS, shown over several nights. For me, it's just dull at any length. Not faring much better is On a Clear Day You Can See Forever, the single worst movie of Barbra Streisand's movie career. Based on the 1965 Broadway hit by Alan J. Lerner and Burton Lane, it stars Streisand as Daisy Gamble, a scatterbrained clairvoyant who goes to a psychiatrist, Yves Montand, in order to quit smoking, and under hypnosis awakens one of her past lives, that of a certain Lady Melinda Winfred Wayne Tintrees, who lived in Victoria, England. Complication? The psychiatrist falls in love with Lady Tintrees. Okay, on the scale of rather batty subject matter, that rate's pretty high, and kinda stupid on the "oh please" meter. And that's pretty much how the movie comes off. It's not as interesting as that plot description, but to be honest, if anyone else was in the lead, I wouldn't even bother. Streisand is wonderful, beating to death a plot that is beneath her. She's beautiful, she's charming, she's funny, and she livens a dead script. And of course her voice is enchanting. Still, watch Funny Girl instead. It's a much better movie. This one's just a puzzle. I'm still trying to figure out that Tron-like opening. Not quite as ridiculous, but not much better, was A Walk in the Spring Rain, which starred Ingrid Bergman, Fritz Weaver, and, believe it or not, Anthony Quinn, as a man that we're supposed to believe is from Tennessee. Bergman is married to Weaver, but then they buy a small farm, she meets and falls in love with Quinn, and complications ensue. This is a difficult film for me to talk about. My brain has formed a Mandela effect. I know that I saw it at some point in my life, I remember it, but the funny thing is, I do not ever remember actively sitting down to watch it. I cannot imagine why. I should remember a movie starring Ingrid Bergman. That's not something I should be forgetting. I'll watch it again and get back to you. Okay, so far I've talked about a string of junky films that were boring and worthless. Fortunately, our next film is a piece of junk that I actually liked. A Bullet for Pretty Boy is an artless, but not too bad ripoff of Bonnie and Clyde, starring teen idol Fabian, here using his full name, Fabian Forte, as famed Depression-era gangster Charles Pretty Boy Floyd. There's nothing really surprising here. He's a nice kid who backs into a life of crime, gets a prison term, and then escapes and becomes a fugitive sought by every law enforcement officer in the country. But the movie is good junk food. The music is good, it has good energy, And Fabian turns in a much better and much more focused performance than the movie probably deserves. Check this one out. I mean, watch Bonnie and Clyde first, but then follow it up with this. I think you'll like it. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, every movie that I'm reviewing for this project is a movie that I've seen at some point in my life. But I'm also taking advantage of the opportunity to see some films that have been on the back burner. I do have a list. One movie in particular that I was looking forward to was Catch-22, Mike Nichols' directorial follow-up to The Graduate. I read Joseph Heller's book in college, and so I was looking forward to seeing how Nichols would sort out the book's surreal passages and disjointed narratives. Sadly, he can't. This movie was a crushing disappointment, and that does not come from my love for the book. I'm not one of those jerks who compares books to movies, but I was hoping that at least in adapting it, screenwriter Buck Henry would retain some of Heller's bizarre logic, and it's just not here. The interior nature of this story is to see the insanity of war from the interior vantage point of a man who is terrified of being killed. That man is Captain John Yozarian, played by Alan Arkin, a World War II bombardier aboard a B-52 medium bomber whose squad's missions involve bombing runs along the Italian mainland. Fearing the same death and dismemberment that is present all around him, he is slowly going mad under the realization that he has reached the number of required missions to rotate out, but the commanding officer, Colonel Cathcart, keeps upping the number of required missions. Ebbing to reasoning, he decides to go out on a psycho, but the military has installed a Catch-22 that is probably more insane than the nature of war itself. Apparently, you can't get out on a psycho if you want it, because the only way to prove that you're really nuts is to keep going on missions and not to ask for it. In other words, according to the brass in charge, no one who wants out could possibly be insane. Okay, now that's a good setup, but this is a very disjointed movie. I was never really sure what I was looking at from one moment to the next. Characters drift in and out, played by a massive cast of actors who are all doing various comedy bits of varying shapes and sizes. And that's the problem. Nichols is going for a balls-out comedy when the movie needs a balance of comedy and drama. For me, I just think that Nichols was the wrong choice of director here, and Henry was the wrong choice of writer. For this material, you needed someone with a surrealist touch like Stanley Kubrick. And it's impossible to look at this movie and not compare it to MASH, which came out early in the year. That film, directed by Robert Altman and written by Ring Lardner Jr., counterbalanced the insanity of being a surgeon in a meaningless and brutal war. It found an even ground to play on. Catch-22 often just feels confusingly episodic. What a disappointment. Opening just 1 week after Catch-22 is a much better World War II movie that has lower ambitions but is probably more purely entertaining than any movie of 1970. This is Kelly's Heroes, yet another descendant of the smart-ass, anti-establishment stick-it-to-the-man genre of war films, wrought by the success of The Dirty Dozen a few years earlier. It stars Clint Eastwood as the leader of a shell-shocked platoon fighting in the European theater in the closing days of the war, who comes across information that there's a German bank in a nearby town that is home to $16 million worth of pure gold bars. What to do? Well, he gathers together some of his men in a plot to steal the gold, split the difference, and go their separate ways. And that's it. This is a heist movie in army camos, and there's really nothing more to it than that. Now, that doesn't make it bad, not in the least. As I said, this is a wildly entertaining movie with a supporting cast filled with familiar faces. Don Rickles, Telly Savalas, Carol O'Connor, Gavin MacLeod, Stuart Margolin, Harry Dean Stanton, and somewhere in here is John Landis, though I was not able to find him. The best performance here, I confess, comes from Donald Sutherland as a spaced-out tank commander named Sergeant Oddball, who seems to be a hippie out of time. His stoner act is out of place in the 1940s, but he's so much fun that you don't really mind. And that's the spirit of this whole movie. You have to drop your film critic security blanket and just go with it. It's a loopy action comedy. There's not a lot of real substance. The movie runs too long, but it's also so much fun that you don't really care. Watch it. It's good junk food. Yet another movie that I watched for the first time, and wow, what can I possibly say about Myra Breckenridge using language that won't make the angels cry? This is a notoriously bad entry in the brief genre of cheeky would-be comedies resultant from the breakdown of the production code, but to be honest, if this is the kind of movie we were waiting for on the other side, it might as well have broken down in 2005. Based on a serial comic novel by Gore Vidal, I never read it. It's a campy send-up of show business, about a transsexual played by Raquel Welch, who convinces her uncle, played by John Huston, to introduce feminism into the curriculum of his acting school. That's the bare bones. The rest of the movie wants to be outlandish and off the chain, but really all it is annoying and loud. It's one of those movies that bypasses camp by trying to be camp, and it's so persistently bad that I confess I didn't finish it. The movie just gave me a headache, and I got so annoyed that I turned it off right about here. The only saving grace is the latter-day performance by Mae West, who was allegedly 75 years old, but she looks great, especially decked out in costumes designed by Edith Head. Both Mae West and Edith Head deserved way better. Well, as bad as that movie was, I confess that it was at least more memorable than the musical Darling Lili, which has a trailer made up of mostly still shots. This was yet another expensive barnacle that drove the American musical right off a cliff. This overripe tripe was directed by Blake Edwards and written, believe it or not, by William Peter Blatty. What could have possessed him to do this? It stars Julie Andrews as a Mata Hari-type dance hall entertainer during World War I, who is really a spy and falls in love with the man that she is trailing, played in a particularly bad performance by Rock Hudson. There is a lot here to let you down. Julie Andrews is miscast, the movie is paced with a lead foot, and the movie was directed by Edwards, who's one of my favorite filmmakers, but when he fails, it's always tantamount to a plane crash. Moving on. When we come back, haircut. The movies of July. There's Jerry Lewis, Gene Wilder, John Wayne, and the single greatest performance of Roger Moore's career.
And now, before the next show starts, let's enjoy an intermission. You'll find our snack bar chock full of good things to eat and drink. Tasty, tempting hot dogs, thirst-quenching soft drinks, fresh, crunchy popcorn, a complete assortment of delicious candy, and a full line of cigarettes. You've plenty of time, so visit the snack bar now. A tasty treat will double your enjoyment of the show. For your convenience, we shall keep you informed of the remaining intermission time, 3 minutes before the next show starts.
On the lighter side of things is the Boatniks from Walt Disney Studios, although if you didn't see that name attached to the opening credits, you might never know. This movie feels like something away from the typical Disney early 70s live-action product. It doesn't star any of the Disney regulars like Dean Jones or Fred MacMurray, and aside from the slapstick gags, it doesn't really have a Disney-esque plot, though it is directed by Norman Tokar, who spent years at the studio directing live-action stuff like this. The Boatniks is a pedestrian romantic comedy starring song and dance man Robert Morse as Ensign Garland, who is assigned by the Coast Guard to patrol Newport Beach, where he falls in love with Stephanie Powers. I mean, who wouldn't? And there he runs afoul of a group of jewel thieves. Again, there are no real Disney signatures here. Any studio could have made this, and I wonder if it wasn't a brief attempt by the studio to get away from the Love Bug style kiddie stuff. And despite the fact that the romance isn't fit for adults and the slapstick isn't fit for kids, it's kind of blah and kind of forgotten. It's not even on Disney+. If it's prestige that you want, there's always the games. I saw this years ago on a local station, and I remember thinking that it looked like one of those movies that was made to be a contender for the Oscars. It has a prestigious cast with Ryan O'Neal, Michael Crawford, Charles Aznavour, and an Aboriginal Australian actor named Athol Compton, who blows all the other actors off the screen. It was directed by Michael Winner, a noted British filmmaker of a lot of action movies and comedies, so this seems a little off his game. It was written by Eric Siegel, who, along with O'Neill and composer Francis Lai, would triumph later in the year with Love Story. Plus, it's got the song From Denver to L.A., sung by Elton John. And it's got one of those plots about well-to-do men from differing cultures competing for different reasons as long-distance runners in the Rome Olympics. And if that at all reminds you of Chariots of Fire, that's because this is essentially the same idea. Only it was probably done way better and more efficiently there. Although I don't discount this movie for its similarities, it's still compelling, and I like the writing, and, strange for me to say, I even liked Ryan O'Neal. That takes some doing. Sadly, the movie was a box office dud. The critics were negative. Gene Siskel hated it. And there was no gold for this movie when it came to Oscars. But I still kind of like it. It's not a great movie, but it's something for a lazy Sunday. But there is no Sunday or any other day that I would feel compelled to recommend Which Way to the Front, a latter-day Jerry Lewis World War II comedy that he produced, directed, and starred in, resulting in a film that was universally hated. Even the poster is annoying. Lewis plays Brendan Byers, a rich playboy during wartime who wants to be part of the effort of tackling the Axis powers. But when he is classified 4F, he uses his fortune to gather other 4F losers for a privately funded mission to fight on the Italian front. The idea is that he will disguise himself as a Nazi officer and order their forces to retreat so that the Allies can advance. But he's an idiot and spends the back half of the movie mostly screaming. It is impossible for me to describe how indescribably indescribable this movie is. It's not only unfunny, it's unwatchable on the basic level of just being coherent as a motion picture. Every scene ends with a still shot. The editing is a mess, and it's badly photographed. The timing of every gag is at least 5 minutes too long, and that's beside the fact that Lewis never stops screaming. It's astonishing that this movie came from a man who's gone down in history for some great innovative work. Lewis is past his prime here. In the wake of this, he would follow it up with his infamous unfinished Holocaust comedy The Day the Clown Cried, and then stayed away from directing for a decade due to health problems, only to return in 1981 with a movie that managed to be even worse. That's an achievement all its own. Fortunately, I have the exact opposite reaction to Quackser Fortune as a cousin in the Bronx. A genuine surprise, and a film that I've been beaming about since I saw it a month ago. This is a dramedy featuring what I think may be the single best performance of Gene Wilder's career. He plays Quackser Fortune, a manure salesman who collects his wares from horse-drawn carts, and he endears himself to the people in his small Dublin community with his easygoing charm, even though they know that he's ignoring the fact that his business is about to be rendered obsolete by the presence of automobiles. I love how he carries a rose around in his manure cart. Story, as it were, begins when he's bowled over by the arrival of Zazel Pierce, an American student played by Margot Kidder, whom he falls in love with, although he's unsure about her. They come from different worlds and seem to have a different way of doing things. She's young and has been around, and he's slightly older, but has remained a fixture of his provincial town. Now that sounds like the makeup for a formula comedy, but this movie is much smarter and self-assured than that. It's about how their personalities lead their decisions. Quackser is innocent, but he's not stupid. He wears his heart on his sleeve, but he isn't afraid to declare when he's been hurt by her, which he has several times. He has a way of courting Zazel that feels at times like a 13-year-old boy just discovering girls for the first time. And all of this comes from Wilder's performance. He does away with his usual over-the-top comedy tricks like the bug eyes and the screaming, and pulls it down to create a truly endearing character. Just about the only issue is trying to buy Gene Wilder as an Irishman, but you quickly get over that. From that, you might guess, this is more a slice of life with the kind of subtle textures that you'd find in one of those imports from Northern Europe in the early 90s. Movies like Raining Stones and Brassed Off. It's not about jokes, it's about people, and the comedy comes from their eccentricities. I was won over by it. Check it out, it's not hard to find. And if Quackser Fortune surprised me in a good way, then Joe was just the opposite. This is one of those window movies where you feel like you're looking into a window of another time. In this case, the anti-establishment revolutionary period of the early 70s, only in the other direction. Directed by John G. Avildsen, who a few years later would direct Jack Lemmon to an Oscar and Save the Tiger, and 3 years after that would direct himself to an Oscar with Rocky, here creates an angry world of violence, fear, and confusion, wrought not from a liberal vantage point, but from an angry conservative whose goal in life is to kill someone who is turning America into a country that he doesn't recognize. The story begins with a wealthy businessman, played by Dennis Patrick, who kills his daughter's boyfriend for turning her into a junkie, and then at a bar meets an angry man named Joe Curran, played by Peter Boyle, who says he'd like to kill a hippie or pretty much anyone who isn't a 9-to-5 white American. This leads to a violent confrontation with the hippies and the daughter, and lands on a twist ending that, frankly, I just didn't believe. Joe is a very angry film with a skewed set of values that, frankly, my 21st century mind just couldn't go with. Peter Boyle, in the role that put him on the map, is very good in the title role, but his character is supposed to be some kind of hero, and really turns out to have no agenda at all. I know that the movie was a box office and a critical hit, Gene Siskel liked it, and it's probably an effective portrait of the national mentality at that point. But I think this kind of scum-sucking dark American landscape was explored much better in Taxi Driver a few years later. I wouldn't deny anyone who finds something to like about Joe. I just would graciously disagree. Although I do kind of like the documentary Jack Johnson. With most of these older documentaries, you have to take the production values with a grain of salt. Jack Johnson is a unique chronicle of the life and career of the heavyweight champ, but it is approached in a narrative manner without talking head interviews. Johnson's words are read by actor Brock Peters over old newsreel footage of his fights and his training, backed up by a rousing score by Miles Davis. Through the narration, we get a sense of time and place of the turn-of-the-century America that is mired in casual and legally sanctioned racism, with which he responded by living an extravagant lifestyle and courting white women out loud and proud, and being responded to by the threats of violence. When he defeated Jim Jeffries in 1910 for the heavyweight championship, the Klan started riots across the country. Jack Johnson was nominated that year for Best Documentary Feature, and it was very timely. It came about because Johnson was of particular interest to the time. Howard Sackler's play The Great White Hope had been a hit on Broadway since it opened in 1968, and the film version would come along later that year starring James Earl Jones. We'll get to that later in the year. One of the great things about doing this video is discovering hidden gems. I've already done that with Quackser Fortune, which featured Gene Wilder's best performance, and now comes The Man Who Haunted Himself, featuring the most astonishing performance of Roger Moore's career. I think because of the too light touch that he brought to James Bond, Moore was written off as a charming but not especially versatile actor. But I think if people take a look at this forgotten performance, they might reevaluate his range, although you have to look around to really find it. It's not readily available. Released just a year after the end of his run as Simon Templar on The Saint, and 3 years before beginning his long-running tenure as James Bond, The Man Who Haunted Himself is a psychological thriller featuring Moore as Hugh Pelham, a stuffy businessman with an ultra-regimented life. One day he has a weird accident after suffering a seizure behind the wheel, and on the operating table, the EKG reads 2 heartbeats. When he wakes up, his life turns into a nightmare. People keep telling him that he's done things that he doesn't recall, like extramarital affairs and agreeing to a business decision that he previously opposed. Is he suffering from a mental block? Is there a doppelganger? The search for those answers leads down a dark path as he goes from frustration to near madness, and Moore doesn't miss a beat. You can really see him challenging himself here in a way that he never would again. The movie itself is quite preposterous, and you can see the ending coming from a mile away. But if you're familiar with Moore's generally unremarkable acting style in every other role, you so appreciate what he puts himself through here. It's a fine performance, and again, his very best. And again, the film is nearly impossible to find. It really should have had a re-release on video when Moore passed in 2017. If you can find it, check it out. It's an undiscovered gem. Our next movie, sadly, is not. Something for Everyone is one of those snakebite movies that shows ridiculously rich people making asses of themselves by being petty and mean and hateful. Based on the novel The Cook by Harry Cressing, the movie stars Michael York as a good-looking kid who charms his way into the job as a chauffeur for an aristocratic family headed by a countess, played by Angela Lansbury, who has run the family fortune into the ground so badly that she isn't even living in her castle anymore, but on the grounds. He runs roughshod over the family, screwing everyone in sight, even the son, and causing general chaos, and eventually works his way into a heartless marriage scheme that will restore the countess's fortune. Now, you should know, I'm not the kind of person who disowns a movie because of the more successful clatter of what came after, but Something for Everyone seemed out of date and out of fashion by the time it premiered. We had already seen Peyton Place and Giant, and in its wake would come a volley of nighttime soap operas that kind of diminished this movie's acid tongue. I saw this again recently, and yeah, it does feel a bit shop-worn in spite of the wicked turn by Lansbury. Speaking of shop-worn, let's get back to the Duke. In 1970, he finally won an Oscar for Best Actor for playing a variation on his image in True Grit, and it was a terrific performance. Chisum, on the other hand, feels like a greatest hits package, encompassing not only retreads of his image, but a confusing mashup of plots from his other movies. Directed by Andrew McLaughlin, son of Victor, who had directed Wayne in some of his lesser movies, this film offers Wayne as a lawman whose hometown is being run into the ground by a corrupt opportunist who's buying and selling and bullying the townsfolk into selling. Yeah, it's the same old anti-capitalist dodge. The problem is that everything in this movie is drawn with broad strokes, so what nuances there are in the characters are bludgeoned by the constant reminders that the Duke was not only a legend, but also a manly man. It's the kind of machismo that wormed its way into the rest of Wayne's career. In the 1970s, after the Oscars, there didn't seem to be too many places for him to go with regards to the Western. He had done it all. But for this decade, I think this and Rooster Cogburn were not only bad, but embarrassing to the point of self-parody. Fortunately, what there was the shootist. We'll get to that later. And if Chisum drowned in its own machismo, then Moo drowns itself in simpering white frustration and first world problems. Oh, won't these beautiful women please stop having sex with me? It's ridiculous. Elliot Gould, who was so good in Getting Straight earlier in the year, plays a playwright who supplements his income by writing pornography and has fantasies about his would-be life as he moves from one end of the West Side to the other, having all kinds of conflicts with his wife, with an overzealous police officer, and with a moving company that keeps screwing him over, and with a blonde with an annoying voice. I saw this some years ago, ironically in the midst of moving and while having a midlife crisis, and even then I thought the movie was pretentious and annoying. Let's move on. When we come back, the movies of August. Paul Newman goes on the air, Barnabas Collins hits it big, and Jack Nicholson rides a motorcycle. Again.
No, that's not big enough. No, that's not big enough either. That's more like it. We're delighted to have you with us, and we extend a cordial welcome to you. We've lined up the top stars from Hollywood and from all over the world to entertain you on our giant screen with the new, colorful motion pictures you've been hearing about and reading about. To add to your enjoyment, we're all wound up to bowl you over at intermission time with live wire service at our snack bar, where you'll find a tempting variety of favorite foods and beverages. Now it's showtime, folks, and you can be sure it's the best show in town. Your continued patronage is very, very welcome.
Well, we start the month of August with a biker flick whose trailer twice reminds us that it features Jack Nicholson from Easy Rider, and also Diane Ladd and Bruce Dern plus Harry Dean Stanton, although the trailer doesn't tell you that. Unfortunately, Rebel Rouser is not all that the trailer promises. It was made in 1967 and then put on the shelf only to emerge after Nicholson made it big with Easy Rider. But he's barely in it. Bruce Dern is reduced to a nothing role. Diane Ladd plays a pregnant woman who spends much of her time screaming while being terrorized by the bikers. And Laura Dern appears in her first feature as the pregnancy. So yeah, the movie's kind of a time capsule, but sadly not much else. It's kind of trashy and not the best showcase for these actors. I have to tell you, on a personal note, 1970 was a year just outside of my time. I was born a year later, and so I have only a second-hand understanding of the time period, especially given the tension of the rather nasty political climate, and that, matched with the tension of an even nastier social climate, makes a movie like WUSA seem, to put it nicely, kind of quaint. This is an acid-tongue political commentary in which the acid dried up long ago. Paul Newman, who often wore his left leanings on his shoulder, plays a drifter named Reinhardt who wanders into a job in a hate-spewing radio station, WUSA, where he is all too happy to recite their nonsense on the air, even though he doesn't quite agree with it. He falls in love with a hooker with a heart of gold, played by Mrs. Paul Newman, Joanne Woodward, who challenges what he's doing and runs afoul of a next-door neighbor who's played by Anthony Perkins, an idealist who understands what WUSA is really all about. Now that sounds great, but if it were only dated, I could live with that. The movie is ambiguous and frustrating in the fact that it never really comes out and says what it means. It wears its political agenda in its coat pocket, but never turns it into a real cause. When we get to the ending with a white power rally, the movie flies apart and goes for theatrics instead of the truth-telling that it promises. This was kind of a disappointment. House of Dark Shadows, however, is a movie that I know all too well. I used to watch Dark Shadows on TV as a kid after school, and I loved it, though it was only later that I understood its tweakings of the shabbiness of daytime soap operas. Today, I think it's downright innovative. House of Dark Shadows unfortunately forgets all that. It's a straightforward horror comedy with the same tone and production values as any Hammer horror film starring Vincent Price, Christopher Lee, and Peter Cushing. The thing that made the TV so special isn't translated, and it's been the problem all along. The movie was successful enough that it spawned a sequel, Night of Dark Shadows, the following year, and that had the same problem. And so did the TV remake in 1991, a proposed remake in 2004, and Tim Burton's unfortunate version in 2012. None of them worked because they forgot the parody element and generally took themselves way too seriously. Fortunately, The People Next Door takes itself just seriously enough without going overboard. It's a family drama starring Eli Wallach and Julie Harris, as a wealthy suburban couple with 3 kids who have to deal with the fact that their youngest daughter has become a drug addict and, gasp, is sexually active. Okay, so if that sounds like the makings of 1,000 terrible made-for-TV movies, well, you'd be half right. It was originally written to be a TV movie based on a teleplay by J.P. Miller for CBS Playhouse, and it's not terrible. Yeah, it has the kind of overacting that was prevalent in TV productions at the time, but there is some real substance here thanks to the cast of some very good actors. You get involved in their plight, even though you already pretty much know the story. It's not perfect, but it's better than anything Hallmark ever put out. Okay, so if you're sitting there saying to yourself, gee, this jerk doesn't like anything, that's actually not true. I find that the reality of reviewing an entire year of movies is that 60% of all movies released in a particular year are generally terrible, even years that are lauded as being seminal to American cinema. 1970 is a good year for movies, and as we inch toward fall, they do get slightly better. One indication is Diary of a Mad Housewife, a well-mounted feminist screed about a good woman named Tina Balzer, played by Carrie Snodgrass, who got an Oscar nomination, who is married to a hyper-toxic jackass played by Richard Benjamin, who treats her like an outlet for meals, for sex, and for self-satisfying public humiliation. What is interesting is that this is not some TV movie about a woman who breaks out of a bad situation. It's about the masochism that perpetrates the mind of someone who's stuck in a situation like this. Of course she hates this treatment. That's why she hooks up with an equally chauvinistic idiot played by Frank Langella. But we sense that there's something in her mind that settles into this kind of treatment. Does she privately enjoy it? Or is she understanding that putting up with this means the over-the-top creature comforts that make up her world will be sustained? Or does she imagine that outside of this she has few other choices? All of this was rolling around in my mind as I watched this character. Director Frank Perry's camera keeps tight on her a lot of the time so that we're forced to imagine her thought process. What's going on in there? We are challenged to imagine what conclusion she is drawing from all of this. That's a challenge, and one I was willing to accept. It's odd that a movie would give us a character of a woman who is taken for granted and seems to enjoy it, but we are asked to consider what she might be thinking. It puts me in mind of 1,000 women who came before her, that post-World War II generation of women who were seen as breeders and fixtures, and not necessarily as human beings on their own terms. This movie was a financial and critical success, but it has dropped almost completely out of public knowledge and out of availability. It's nearly impossible to find, but if you do, I'd love to hear from you. I think it will piss some people off, but I was willing to go with it. See if you can find it.